We remember the end of the Cold War in iconic images. We see joyous crowds tearing down the Berlin Wall piece by piece. We hear the speeches of Ronald Reagan demanding that Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall. We see the triumph of Western democracy over 70 years of communist tyranny. This is the simple, heroic story we've been sold. But it's a lie. The Cold War was not won by speeches, nor was it a simple victory of ideology. The Soviet Union was not defeated in a single glorious battle. It went bankrupt. It was an empire hollowed out from the inside, a global superpower whose economic heart had stopped beating long before its political body finally fell. This was not a political failure. It was a financial one. A slow, grinding collapse engineered by the very system designed to guarantee its permanence. This channel uncovers these hidden financial histories. If you believe that economic reality, not political promises, truly shapes our world, then hit that subscribe button and join us. Because the story of the Soviet Union's financial self-destruction is a terrifying warning about the lies modern governments tell themselves and us. To understand the collapse, you must first understand the fatal flaw in the Soviet Union's DNA, the command economy. In the West, prices, supply, and demand create a chaotic but brutally efficient economic conversation. In the Soviet Union, there was no conversation, only a monologue. A vast labyrinthine bureaucracy in Moscow called Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, dictated every single economic decision. They decided how many tons of steel to produce, the price of a loaf of bread, the number of shoes to be manufactured in a factory in Ukraine, and the wages of a doctor in Siberia. It was the ultimate expression of control, an attempt to replace the organic chaos of a market with the cold logic of a spreadsheet. But it was an illusion. Without real prices, there is no real information. Without competition, there is no incentive for quality or innovation. The result was an economy of absurdities. A factory might fulfill its quota by producing 1 million left shoes and no right ones. Another might produce tractors that were too heavy, consuming vast amounts of steel but sinking in the mud. Store shelves were empty of basic goods like soap and toilet paper, while warehouses rusted with tons of useless industrial nails that nobody needed. It was a system that waged war on reality itself. For decades, the deep sickness of this system was masked by a single commodity: oil. The oil price shocks of the 1970s, which crippled the West, were a spectacular windfall for the Soviet Union. Suddenly, a flood of hard currency, real US dollars, poured into the Kremlin's coffers. This oil money was a curse disguised as a blessing. Instead of using this once-in-a-generation opportunity to reform their broken system, the aging leadership under Leonid Brezhnev used it as a painkiller. They became addicts. Did their hopelessly inefficient collective farms fail to produce enough food? No need for reform. They could now buy cheap grain from America and Canada. Did they need advanced technology their system couldn't innovate? They could buy it from the West. This era of stagnation was bought and paid for with oil money. It created a dangerous dependency, tying the entire fate of the Soviet Empire to a global price they could not control. As the 1980s began, the addicted and stagnant empire was hit by two massive self-inflicted financial wounds that would bleed it dry. The first was Afghanistan. The 1979 invasion was meant to be a swift assertion of power. Instead, it became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a brutal, unwinnable quagmire. But it was also a financial black hole. Billions of rubles and, more importantly, vast sums of precious hard currency were vaporized in the mountains and valleys of Central Asia, funding an army that produced nothing but casualties and dissent. The second wound was the renewed arms race. When Ronald Reagan announced a massive U.S. military buildup in the futuristic Star Wars defense initiative, it was not just a military challenge, It was an economic declaration of war. The U.S. economy, though troubled, was dynamic and innovative enough to afford it. Reagan was betting that the Soviet economy was not. He was right. The Kremlin felt it had no choice but to match the spending, weapon for weapon, missile for missile. They diverted the last vestiges of their productive capacity away from the civilian economy and into the military-industrial complex. It was a check they simply could not cash. In the mid-1980s, the final act began. The price of oil on the world market collapsed. The addict's supply line was severed. The flow of U.S. dollars that had propped up the entire rotting edifice for 2 decades slowed to a trickle. Suddenly the mask was ripped off and the terrifying face of Soviet economic reality was exposed. They could no longer afford to import enough grain. The queues for bread, a symbol of life in the USSR, grew longer and more desperate. The social contract, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us, shattered when the state could no longer even provide the basics. The empire could no longer afford its outposts. The massive subsidies propping up the puppet regimes in Eastern Europe were cut. The Iron Curtain wasn't torn down by popular will alone. It was repossessed by the Kremlin for non-payment. Mikhail Gorbachev's famous reforms, glasnost and perestroika, were not the enlightened policies of a visionary. They were the desperate last-ditch actions of a CEO trying to save a bankrupt corporation. But it was too little, too late. Glasnost, or openness, simply gave a voice to 70 years of pent-up misery and frustration. And perestroika, or restructuring, only served to break the old system without providing a new one, leading to even greater economic chaos. So why does the collapse of a long-dead communist empire matter to you on October 2nd, 2025? Because the Soviet Union is the ultimate case study of what happens when a state believes it can defy economic gravity indefinitely. The central planning of Gosplan, which led to chronic shortages, finds its echo in the policies of modern central banks, which try to centrally plan interest rates and asset prices, distorting the entire economy. The Soviet Union's unsustainable military spending, which bled it into bankruptcy, is a chilling parallel to the West's own spiraling national debts, funded not by production but by the endless printing of currency. The empty shelves of Moscow are a historical warning of what happens when governments implement price controls on energy, food, or housing, believing they can legislate away scarcity. The USSR proved a timeless lesson. No amount of military might, nuclear weapons, or ideological conviction can save a system that is financially and economically bankrupt. The Soviet Union was not brought down by an external enemy. It was consumed by its own internal contradictions. It was a system that declared war on human nature and on the fundamental laws of economics. And it lost. Economic gravity is undefeated. You cannot print your way to real prosperity. You cannot command value into existence. You cannot subsidize your way out of a crisis forever. Reality always, eventually presents the bill. The unforgiving lesson of the Soviet collapse is to build your own life on principles of real value, not on the shifting promises of a system that believes it can ignore the rules. If this gave you a new perspective on the true fall of an empire, prove you're a student of history. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.